You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
Greetings, exalted ones, and welcome to this week's Making Tracks, a Book of Boba Fett reaction chat brought to you by those skugholes over at fanfatracks.com. Before we go any further, this is a spoiler-filled discussion, so if you haven't seen episode 4 of the Book of Boba Fett yet, then what the hell are you doing? Go stream that sucker. So, if you remember, in chapter 3, The Streets of Mos Espa, we saw Boba's adopted Tusken clan get obliterated by the Kintan Striders. He recruited his own group of modified youths known as Mods, and he made peace with the Hutt twins, who gave him a nice baby Rancor. And we found out that the mayor of Mos Espa has not only double-crossed Boba, but the Hutt twins as well, and has sided with the Pikes. So before we dive into Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm, I should introduce my co-host, who I can only describe as the biggest scughole, and of all the fanthers, it's Mr. Mark Newbold. Mark, how you doing, buddy?
Wow, how do I don't even know where to go with that. I'll just have to own it. I am a scughole.
Yeah.
How are you, Mark?
I'm good. I mean, I was itching since last week's episode. I really wanted to start using skugholes, and I haven't actually called anybody a scughole yet, and it's just happened to fall down that it's you who's got the first honorary anointment of it being a scughole. So I think we should get a t-shirt with that printed on.
I have a feeling that this was all carefully planned, but I'll take it for what it is. Thank you.
Of course it is, yeah. So, Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm. What was your initial thoughts, buddy?
Really impressed. I love the way it played off more off a Mandalorian episode than almost what we've seen in Boba Fett so far, which I thought was really cool for linking stuff in. Directed by a guy called Kevin Tancharoen, who's done Fame, Glee Live, Mortal Kombat, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I guess that's the big connection, is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So he's worked with Ming-Na Wen before. Done a great job because there's a lot of moving parts in this one. Just everything about it. It touched on Return of the Jedi in places, obviously. Certainly on the Mando stuff, as we said. Very impressed, very pleased. Last week's episode, as we said on the episode 1 to 3 of Making Tracks, was quite divisive, isn't the right word, but it divided opinion. Let's say that. Yeah,
it wasn't quite as strong a reaction as other Star Wars properties, but I think there was definitely some creative choices, especially in the design of characters and stuff like that, which really created some division in the fandom.
Yeah, it did. And I think this episode, weirdly, doubled down on that with the mod parlor. You know, they go to this mod parlor on the outskirts of Mos Eisley, which I loved. And it just gave you that sense that life has moved on a bit. It's not exactly the same town. Like Mos Espa's not the same town. You know, things have happened and things have expanded and changed. They say that it's kind of part of the Pike's sort of spice run. There's obviously stuff on the planet that organisations want. You see that in the meeting at Jabba's Palace. We should stop calling it Jabba's Palace. It's Boba's Palace.
Boba's Palace, yeah.
That sequence there with Fennec in the past, which was the scene that riffed off Chapter 5 of The Mandalorian, the Gunslinger. It just felt right. It worked. It riffed off a lot of the Kieran Gillen Vader run. You had a lot of characters in that who had mechanical parts.
Yeah.
Obviously, Valance is the big one, but you see it in the comics a lot. You've not really been able to see it to any great degree in live action. Now the effects are so tight and tidy, they can show it now. So that actually worked, and that did play off last week's Speeder Gang thing, which really worked. What did you make of it?
I mean, I think actually in that respects, what it kind of does, it doubles down on that relationship and why actually Boba was, fairly keen to bring these kids on board, because I suppose in some respects you couldn't have him dismiss them so easily. So I think that was pretty cool. And I really liked that whole tattoo parlor. It kind of looked like a modified tattoo parlor. And did you notice that the dude who actually does repair, shall we say, for lack of a better term, it's not really surgery, it's repair, on Fennec, he actually had like a super battle droid hand where he disconnects.
Yes.
And I was like, got to be careful where you put that thing, So generally, all in all, I think this was a much stronger episode. And for me anyway, personally, this ticked a lot of the boxes that I've been speaking about on the previous episodes of Making Tracks, about we didn't really understand Boba's motivation. We now start to fill in the blanks between his relationship with Fennec, and so we can now kind of assume that actually it doesn't go back any further really beyond reputation than what we see in this episode.
Well, she definitely knew who he was. when he
Yes.
explained. She didn't believe him, but she knew who he was. You're dead. Boba Fett's dead,
Yeah.
you know. Oh, no. You know, we both survived. We both died on the sands of Tatooine, but here we are, sort of thing, that little sequence. But again, he knew exactly who she was. And it was like Kasantan last week, Black Kasantan, when he was like, he calls him Gladiator. And in this one, it was Master Assassin. So her reputation precedes her in the same way that anybody who comes across Boba Fett is going to expect the silhouette, the helmet, the whole thing. And this isn't that guy. This is a dude dressed in basically Tusken clothing, you know, with a gaffy stick and the whole thing. So there was that nice, and I really enjoyed this dance between Fennec and Boba.
Yeah.
There was no antagonistic moments, really. They were kind of on the same page from the start, and she clearly throws a lot in with him. And what I really liked, and they didn't make a big song and dance about it, which they can do sometimes, and it over-eggs it, was that he clearly appreciated the fact that when he's like, where do you want dropping off? And she's like, I think I'll stick along for the ride. And then they get to that whole sequence where she's like, I don't want to work for somebody. I'm an independent operator. And he says, you know, oh, no, I'm going to cut you in. You're going to be part of this. You're going to profit. You're going to benefit. And it goes to that sequence later on. Okay, you don't see the Rancor this week apart from the claws. But in the trailer, you saw that in the trailer, but I didn't realise that was in the main audience chamber.
No.
That was over the pit. He's been so mellow and so cooperative. You know, he's like, he wants to make this work. So he's not throwing threats around because that's kind of not his MO anymore. But there's just that little bit where you've got to put your foot down a little bit and sort of let it be known that I'll only be pushed so far, guys.
It was quite interesting because in some respects, I mean, I know we're jumping way ahead to like near the end of the episode, but kind of expect him to kind of form this kind of alliance. But basically, all he can get out of them at the end of the day is just kind of an agreement that they're not going to stab him in the back. And you even wonder actually how much water does that hold, really, that agreement. You know, they didn't even spit and shake on it. They just kind of said, yeah, okay. It'll be interesting to see then what happens. But I suppose it's in their best interest because they don't obviously want to make an enemy of Boba Fett, and especially if he's going to be on the rise and taking over Jabba and Bib's empire. But also, they don't want a war on two fronts, which is basically what it comes down to. You know, they don't want to fight the Pikes as well as Boba.
No, that's right. But it's the same logic with Boba as when they go to Jabba's palace and he says goodbye to the Bantha and says, go out to the dunes, make baby Banthas, that whole thing. Because his logic to Fennec was, well, I either get my ship or I'm dead. And it's the same with this. It's like, I either defeat the Pikes or I'll probably die trying. And then if I do defeat the Pikes, how can these guys not respect me?
Exactly.
Because it's all about respect. So he's playing a gambit here. It's definitely a gambit. He was very quick. There was no negotiation. It was like, okay, you don't want to fight? Well, at least just promise you'll just stay out the way.
Yeah.
And so for me, because I've seen a couple of people online sort of go, well, that was an anticlimax. No, it's not an anticlimax. He's playing a very clever game there.
Yeah.
He's psyched them out in a way. And I think when they leave and they're just him and Fennec are on the balcony watching them go, I think he knows, and she definitely knows, he's playing a game. We're moving forward in two storylines here, predominantly the past, which we'll get to in a second, which I thought was fascinating. I love how every episode, it's not like a 50-50 split. It just goes where the story dictates.
Exactly.
And it's like you said at the top of the episode, you know, this is very much filling out the reasons why, one, why Fett does what he does, and two, why Fennec has thrown a lot in with him.
I want to see, by the last episode of this season, you know, the final cutscene, post-credits, I want to see that Bantha walking along into the sunset with a couple of little baby Banthas.
Wow.
Yeah, there you go.
Seriously, if that was the final shot of season 1 of the Book of Boba Fett, I wouldn't be disappointed.
Yeah.
I would quite like that.
It was really fun, actually. I thought the whole interplay that he actually has with the Bantha, it reminds me of Sam Gamgee from Lord of the Rings and his kind of like interplay with Bill the Pony. It was just really nice to see that much characterization of a Bantha, you know, with him licking its lips and shaking its tail and stuff. I mean,
and eating meat.
And eating meat, exactly. So, which is probably clearly a treat for it. So, I mean, admittedly, Boba did have to drag him past what looks like the corpse or, you know, the remains of a dead Bantha on his tracks. So, I'm sure that was probably quite upsetting for the Bantha.
Hi, this is Guy Henry, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks. Enjoy.
The flashbacks. This has become, I think, a really interesting, positive plot device for this show. They've kept it pretty tight because they could have spent a lot of time with the Tuskens, but actually it's clear from that conversation with Fennec and Boba that actually he did spend a lot of time with those Tuskens. but not a lot's happened that is relevant to the story, which obviously then means that we can now have a whole run of comics about Boba and the Tuskens. But it also means that, they've been really precise that they can jump to the various points. And, let's talk about that crossover with Chapter 5 of Season 1 of The Mandalorian. So we kind of see a couple of different kind of shots in those flashbacks, which actually kind of you start to see where those two episodes are crossing over before we even get to Boba actually rescuing and saving Fennec. For instance, if you remember in last week's episode, we see as Boba's riding into Mos Eisley, we see actually Pelimoto and her little parade of pit droids walking, we guess, towards Docking Bay 94. Now, that actually happens as Boba's passing a load of Stormtrooper helmets on spikes. And we even see that in Chapter 5 of The Mandalorian. We see Din Djarin kind of pass all those helmets on spikes. And obviously, in Chapter 5, he's getting Pelimoto to repair the Razor Crest. So they've almost crossed paths a couple of times. And then the big obvious one is those big flares. So if you remember from Chapter 5 for Gunslinger, Din Djarin uses those flares to blind Fennec's like infrared scopes so that they can get closer to her when she's up on that rock.
Exactly, yeah. When we first saw it, I thought, oh, that's a ship going off. And then you saw the second flare go, and I go, hang on, that's the Gunslinger. That's the scene from the Gunslinger. And another thing I liked about that as well, which maybe I'm overthinking it, but to me it felt like a decision that Fett made purposefully, was when he finds Fennec and collects her, takes us to Mos Eisley on the Bantha, gets her repaired. He takes her back to where he found her, essentially. It's back on that sort of cliff area.
It is, pretty much.
And so when she wakes up, she's like, it's almost like she's woke up from a dream, and it takes her a minute to gather herself and then look down and, what's going on when you see the insides of her. But nevertheless, to me, he could have woke her up in a room, he could have woke her up anywhere, but he took her back to where he found her. And to me, I don't know what that quite says, but it definitely says something.
It almost seems like the honest thing to do would be to like, right, well, I don't know where you were, but let's take you back to where I found you, and then you can go your own way from there if you need to. So again, it's a good way of him kind of building up trust in that relationship between him and Fennec.
That felt key and central to the whole episode, didn't it? Because we first met Fennec in, obviously, The Mandalorian, and then Bad Batch and so on further in the past, more flashback. She's a character we're getting to know quite well. But it's sort of in pieces. And now this, as well as filling in what Fett's motivations are, because obviously he's the central character and it's all about his story, name above the title sort of thing. It's also telling us quite a bit about Fennec. He says it to her, he says, people like us always get screwed over by the gang lords. And she says, why do you want to start your own goat show? Why do you want to start your own house? Yeah. We're always screwed over. We should be the ones running it. We're the smart ones. We should be doing this, not them. How many times have you gone out on a job and you've thought, this isn't worth it? It's like the war, isn't it? All the generals sitting in a room with little chess pieces on a table going, well, let's send this 1,000 men to the Western Front and send that 2,000 men to the Eastern Front or whatever. And they're just chess pieces to them. They don't mean anything. And the gang lords get carried into town on a litter. Well, Fett's quite willing to walk into town, and God, he must pound some miles. He clearly travels. He's happy to walk. It's not a problem for him. So that, again, it's almost like he almost wants to be a man of the people. He's not. He's not a man of the people.
No, by any stretch.
He's never lived a life like that. But just that sequence when he's with the Tuskens in Chapter 2, when he sees the guy at that homestead getting the crap kicked out of him by the biker gang, he kind of winces. He doesn't want to see it almost because he's had this massive life change. He's never going to be pals with that guy. He's not going to be friends with the guys at Toshi Station. That's not what it's about. But he definitely, to me anyway, at this point, feels that they're perfectly entitled to live their life, live a quiet life, live a hard-working life, look after your family. He's kind of about that because at the end of this episode, he says, what's it all about if you haven't got a tribe sort of thing? Mm-hmm. So he wants to build this family, and of course, massive musical cue to what's coming up in Chapter 5 right at the end.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, precisely. We're going to look back from the end of the season and you're going to see, okay, well, so he's recruited Fennec, and he's recruited the Vesper gang, and he's going to recruit Chrysanthemum as well. I think that's likely to happen. Or whether or not it's recruit, or maybe he will actually have to almost hire him on a more traditional kind of sense. I don't know with Chrysanthemum whether or not, whilst Wookiee's honourable, but whether or not he's that way inclined to kind of give his loyalty that easily. I think he's more likely to be swayed with credits and stuff.
Although saying that, I mean, Garliff Whip said, if you just walk away now, I'll clear your bar tab. And he still had to rip that guy's arm off, didn't he? Don't worry, they grow back. It's not a problem.
That's a very good point.
For everything in one location, Daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds. Bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
We haven't seen many fairly ordinary Trandashans, really, I think, in Star Wars. You know, we've seen Bosk, and then, you know, the few that we have seen always seem to be fairly kind of violent and stuff. But these guys were, you know, they were just playing Dabo, basically. They were just there, just playing Dabo and just, you know, having a good time and stuff. This massive, huge Wookiee.
Spoiling for a fight.
He's spoiling for a fight because I think he's got a bruised ego because of the way that he got his arse handed to him at Boba's palace, and then also let off in the way that he did. You know, I'm sure he's not used to that kind of act of kindness, for a lack of better terms. So,
but do you think though that I like your thought train of he won't throw his lot in with Boba Fett like Fennec has, because they've got that shared experience of near-death experiences on Tatooine, both found in the desert kind of scenario, quite similar really. And I'm sure at some juncture you'll have a Bad Batch story with a young Boba Fett, and he just won't remember he's met Fennec. But Fennec remembers meeting him, but she's going to play it cool and not say anything because, you know, why give the advantage away sort of thing.
Exactly.
But I think with Kasantan, I think it's exactly like you said. I think it'll come down to credits. And I think if the next guy comes along and offers more and it suits his purposes, he'd probably flip-flop. We know Chewie. We know Chewie's a warrior. He's a tough guy. But he does have a code of honour. But that always felt like quite a unique scenario. Wookiees aren't Alsatians. They're free-thinking beings of their own volition, you know? And it just happened that Chewie felt indebted to Han Solo because of what happened and pledged himself by choice. And really, who's going to say anything if he'd have decided at any juncture he was going to walk away? But he never did. They were friends. Kasantan might be a Wookiee with very different Wookiee in the same way that, let's say, Bo-Katan and Boba Fett are very different Mandalorians. You know, they've got a different view on things. So it'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was quite fun to see was that hangar and that side of the palace. We know it's bigger than what we see from the outside, but, you know, to see the big hangar and the whole kind of action kind of set piece that happened from it within there was pretty cool.
What I'm definitely going to do at some point before the next episode is pull out the old cross-sections, the essential cross-sections, the DK books, because I do know that I think it was Richard Chasemore did a beautiful double page, if I remember, cross-section of Jabba's palace where so much is the obvious stuff that you can see and where the audience chamber is and where the Rancor pit is and the main doors and all that stuff. But also a lot of it was underground, like prison cells underground and all sorts of stuff. So it was a much bigger, more involved building than it looks on the surface. It wasn't just what you saw. And it's like you just said, it's like seeing the palace from the back. That's the trade entrance. That's where you'd go in generally to see Boba Fett, not knocking on the front door to make a big palaver. You'd go through the tradesman's entrance. That felt like the tradesman's entrance. That's where the skiffs were and, you know, and all that stuff, which was kind of cool to see. It reminded me a lot of two things from Force Awakens. First, finding the Falcon under the tarpaulin. Nobody had really done anything with it.
No.
And it was a bit rusty and not really doing much. But the Falcon had sat there for 10 years or something crazy, hadn't it? But Slave One, you'd imagine, has probably sat there for 4 or 5 years by this point. Considerable amount of time. And also the escape, realising how tough these ships are. You always thought that they'd take a bang and they'd get dented. It's like, no, the Falcon was as tough as anything. It was solid. And here, Slave One's crunching through concrete to turn around so it can sort of work its way out. One thing I really enjoyed and wanted to get your thoughts on it, 2 scenes. One scene that made me punch the air with glee was him taking out that biker gang when you see Slave One in the distance coming in.
Yeah, that was a beautiful shot. It was kind of just majestic because, like, you just didn't hear it as well. It just kind of, like, it comes up. And even when he starts firing, those guys, they can't do anything. They've got nowhere to go, nowhere to run. No. They just carry on barreling it down through the desert. And it's like, it's only ever going to end one way.
It was beautifully done. But the other one, straight after that, and he's like, I've got a few debts to settle. And I kind of thought when he said it, this is leading into other episodes. This is him sort of making that statement so you go back and go, that's what he was talking about. But he dealt with it straight away. Wipe out those guys and then go to the Sarlacc to get his armor, which of course we know is not there.
Oh, yeah, totally. That after the first chapter, I had kind of said, you know, when he emerges from the sand, is a Sarlacc alive or dead, or has he killed it? Now we know that the Sarlacc's had its fill, and it probably doesn't actually move around that much. It's more like a Venus flytrap, and it's not until something kind of encroaches into it that it's like, I'm going to have a go. It kind of gave me memories, like, shades of the Exogorth from Empire Strikes Back with the mouth and the teeth and stuff. You have a little jump scare. It was properly telegraphed, and I loved how Fennec used the seismic charge. So that's kind of cool. That's like a callback to Attack of the Clones, and kind of going back to that hangar scene with the escape. That also kind of gave me kind of memories of Attack of the Clones when he's in Slave One and Django's fighting Obi-Wan on the outside, and he can't do anything other than kind of basically rotate the ship pretty much. And this kind of similar kind of thing happened in the hangar. So it was really nicely done, both for biker revenge and also get the armor back. Yeah,
that felt like old school Boba Fett, didn't it?
Which is good. Which is, I think, what it kind of says is that actually, if something has pissed him off, if something's important to him, and then he is going to act. He isn't just going to try and get everybody to sit around with the campfire all the time. And I think that's going to be an important thing. It's like he's now a man of more facets, so it's not just kind of like for one note, we never see his face, he's just going to kick ass and apologise later, if he apologises. If there's a reason to act, he's going to act. So I thought that was probably a really good way of kind of showing that. And actually, it didn't take up a huge amount of time in the whole episode, which again, considering it was like 46 minute episode, the amount of stuff actually we get in, the amount of story beats and kind of exposition, and that this is quite a crammed episode.
It really was a busy episode, and I kept waiting for the credits to start, and then there was a bit more. I was like, this is very welcome. I wasn't expecting it to be this long.
Fantatrax.
One thought occurs. He says, I've got some old scores to settle. I'm just wondering, and I don't know whether it will happen, and there's been rumours about it. Whether it comes to pass, I don't know. But wouldn't you think that one score might be to settle with the guy that put him in there in the first? Exactly. Solo's the one that kind of put him in that pit in the first place. Might be too much to hope for. Luke turned up at the end of season 2 Mando, so
it's possible, and it's not like, Harrison Ford's not working on another Lucasfilm project at the moment, because he is. He's working with Indy 5. I think the question is whether or not he needs to settle the score with Solo, or actually by the time we get to the end of chapter 7 or 8, whether or not actually he's moved beyond that. The whole transformation that he's kind of had through dealing with the Tuskens and stuff, you kind of think that actually the old Boba, that would be it. I'm going to get Slave One back and get my armor back, and then I'm going to go kick Han Solo's ass. But now, it's not I don't necessarily think that's the case. I mean, that was always the case in the expanded universe, wasn't it, really? And it kind of makes sense in a very narrow field kind of perspective. But, if they're trying to kind of give this character a little bit more depth and a little bit more scope to play a bigger, more important role in galactic events going forward, well, then maybe, trying to kind of settle the score with Solo might kind of be a little bit of a step back for the character.
I think I said it last week. It feels like he's almost humble. Maybe that's not the right word, but it's certainly more contemplative. He's thinking things through more than he probably did before. He was a man of action before. Being in the Sarlacc physically affected him. Going back into the Sarlacc in this episode and getting covered in all that crap again clearly did. In the current scenes, the now scenes, the Mando season 2 scenes, if you want to call it that, or 2.5, the droid tells him when he gets out of that Bacta thing, you are now healed. Yeah. So you wonder whether there's any requirement now for flashbacks or framework for flashbacks, because now we're in the now.
That's just it. And when you think about it, once we kind of get to that point whereby we're into like the Mandalorian kind of timeline, as it were, and he's met Fennec, we have a brief glimpse of him dispatching Bib. I guess maybe it's basically, it's pretty much saying, well, look, there's nothing much else to show you. You don't necessarily need to see anymore. So, as you said, with the droid then confirming that he doesn't need to go back into the Bacta, probably that means that we won't have to have any more of these flashbacks, which probably means that from now on this could be a very linear story moving forward in that present timeline, which actually will be quite interesting, because that is the part between the two storylines. I think that's the one that has been building slowly, but has kind of at points felt it a little bit neglected, in favour of making sure that we get all this backstory.
Do you think from next week on, from 5, 6 and 7, the final episodes, the chapter 7, that it probably will be Fett has now laid the table out, the other gang leaders in the area know what he's planning on doing, stay out of the way. Kassantan's kind of teed up to be involved. Fennec's clearly all in. He's got his shit back. Everything's there now for him to go and do what he needs to do.
The question is whether or not we're going to see Din Djarin in the next episode, or if it's going to be, again, maybe held for like the episode after. You wonder if he needs to have a run-in with the Pikes by himself first to kind of be beaten down a little bit before Din comes in. And then the question is actually, in terms of a timeline, is this the way that actually we kind of get out of that story cul-de-sac that we kind of almost got into at the end of season 2 of The Mandalorian?
Yes.
What happened then with respects to like
the Darksaber?
Yeah, so maybe actually it's not actually something that needs to be discussed then and then. You know, we just see it's moved on and Din's out in the galaxy. So it'd be interesting to see, and whether or not actually Din comes by himself or does Bo-Katan come with him. All these questions. It's I think it's going to be ramping up to be a really, really strong end to this first season.
I was thrilled with Chapter 4, really enjoyed it, more than I expected, because so much happened, so many things got answered. So many cool things got confirmed. It is Max Rebo. I was chuffed to bits that it is Max Rebo.
That was cool. And also one other thing, the Gamorreans in that flashback, and I think I know what it is that isn't making me like the Gamorreans of the present day. It's because they're not wearing clothes. Those Gamorreans wearing like their leather jerkins and stuff like that looked more like Gamorreans that we're used to seeing. And I'm thinking, and I was like, I wonder if it's just that. I wonder if it's just because they're running around shirtless that is making me kind of lose my lunch every time I see them.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've covered The Gathering Storm. Good title as well. Good solid title. I like that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's very indicative of like, you know, the oncoming battle, you know. I mean, Gandalf said something very similar on the top of Minas Tirith where he kind of said, you know, it's the deep inhale before the plunge or something like that. So it has a very similar kind of vibe.
Shall we walk out of this episode and tell people where to find us next?
Let's leave it there. And Mark, you should probably let people know because you have the notes and I don't.
As always, if you want to be part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit panthertracks.com or check out the free Panther Tracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@panthertracks.com. Get your questions in because now we're talking about this on a Wednesday. We need more stuff to talk about in our regular episodes. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds @PantherTracks. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Panther Tracks intro, Adam O'Brien for our Making Tracks opening music, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. And I think that's me done for this episode.
Make sure you join us again for Tuesday's episode of Making Tracks. So until then, may the Force be with you.
Coming up next on Panther Tracks Radio, it's another episode of Making Tracks.